Welcome to this webinar, Exploring Financing Systems for Sustainable Impact. As we can see, something essential here has to do with measuring the social or sustainable impact, how to account for that impact. And the relevance of this aspect is the difference between gaining the funding or not. So the evidence supporting the expectation or the offer that the social entrepreneur is making as to what will happen if his or her organization obtain the resources required to operate in the way it is planned, needs to be carefully anticipated, depending on what can actually be measured. And there is a common situation in which some ideas that in abstract may seem ideal to take place, that could lead to very good positive results for everyone. In practice, even if they are happening, we could face the challenge of not being able, for methodological reasons, to show that actually that impression that we have of a positive change cannot be demonstrated to the investor. So it is crucial to count with a very clear strategy about it, and to decide on what is the best methodology for doing that process of accounting for the impact created. There are different alternatives to measure that and to present information in the form of a report to investors, to sponsors. But one that has become broadly accepted is what is known as the social return on investment. Something important to mention here is that this methodology will lead us to a number, a figure that we could present in the form of a ratio that will help us to show how much was invested or was required for an organization to achieve certain level of positive impact, and how that impact is valued. And here is the important bit, because that value will necessarily be subjective. It's very difficult that we could attribute a value in money that will satisfy everyone in the same way as it could be in mainstream economy. So here one of the problems is that what we want to account is for the changes, the positive changes created in society, in a way that those changes are valued by the stakeholders that we are trying to support. The thing is, we need to find out whether or not they actually value it. It means something special to those stakeholders, but also how much they value that change or that transformation that could be attributed to what we are doing. So at the end of the day, our value will depend. It will depend on the opinion, the perception, or the evidence that we could have as to how much that transformation is making a difference. to the people that are experiencing the transformation of the circumstances, and we need to make sure that we can prove that the transformation is something that actually can be attributed to what we did and not something that is likely that would have happened anyway, regardless of our intervention. So that is one important challenge that might seem simple, but it is not in practice. No? In order to achieve this, an organization for this purpose needs to have a theory of change, and it's complicated sometimes to produce a meaningful theory of change. So the process of understanding why you need a theory of change and why a theory of change, even if it was well designed, will not necessarily be adequate as time goes by, because circumstances will change, and because the aspect that will be particularly relevant in certain moment may not necessarily be equally important or even relevant at all. So all these things make the push for the need of constant monitoring and constant checking, and that involves decision that needs to take place within the organization that is intending to look for social investment for their activities. So that is something to take into account. One tool that will help us to control, to identify the impact that we might be exploring is the outcomes matrix that was produced by a partnership of some organizations in the UK. It was essentially developed by the big society capital, but with other financial intermediaries, with other organizations like the New Philanthropy Capital, Social Value International, and Triangle Consulting, the Good Analyst. So this outcome matrix will be available to you for free. Is in a website that I'm providing you with the link to that. And it's very useful because it establishes a series of indicators and topics specific of a specific attention that are likely to be relevant depending on a selection of the areas and the sectors in which your organization is working. So it makes very easy to come up with a relevant number of elements that needs to be in the equation of what is that you are going to measure and why. That is not necessarily a solution for everything that you need or should measure, but it gives you immediately a very good series of points to organize in your system of exploring and monitoring your impacts. So this tool has also the benefit of being very easy. It's very easy to learn how to use and very flexible for different projects. In the case of this talk, I selected as an example the 9 outcome areas that are provided in this outcome matrix. That includes, as you can see, the employment, training and education. income and financial inclusion, mental health and well-being, citizenship and community, conservation and the natural environment, housing and local facilities, physical health, family, friends and relations, arts, heritage, sports and faith. And in this case, in particular, the outcome area of conservation of the natural environment could be of special interest to many of you. As you can see from that, you can display the different elements depending on whether you are focusing if your stakeholders are individuals or they are communities or a combination. So as you can see now, these are the different additional options that help you to identify the very specific elements that could be relevant for different types of circumstances. So here you can see also that you can, for each of the general elements, you can display further aspects. For example, if you see in terms of sustainable buildings transport, you can see sustainable transport, core environmental focus areas for building management of green buildings, construction and renovation of buildings and environmental purpose, etc. So this is something that I believe you may be very interested in exploring and seeing whether or not your expectation of what you think is relevant in those particular areas is according to what you are seeing in this outcome matrix, and from that you could start developing your own bespoke criteria for your own purposes. Now something to mention is about the principles of social value. The organization Social Value International has contributed with the setting of these 7 principles that helps much when looking at the challenges of how to and why some indicators should be there and how you should look at the different activities within the process of monitoring for social value. The first one is involve stakeholders, and that is crucial. The key of this has to do with the identification of the different stakeholders, while there might be many that are outside of your particular area of interest as an organization. It's important that you have a conscious decision as to which particular stakeholders are you targeting and which ones are you intentionally ignoring due to the relevance or not of your organization. The second principle has to do with understanding what exactly is changing. There could be many different levels and forms of possible change, but it's important that the evidence that you gather helps you to identify positive and negative changes, and when those are intended or non-intended. That combination of components of the change or the variations that you could be responsible for is essential in the idea of why you want to have a social impact assessment, as opposed to simply just comply with a report to justify your activity to the eyes of your sponsor. So the implications are serious here, because the sole identification of negative changes, negative effects that you could be generating should be there and should be very clearly stated why you didn't pick on those before, if that is the case. So that is important, because usually the attention goes only to identify what positive things we have done or we have achieved in our organization, regardless of the other things that won't make interested my sponsor, for example. And actually it is important for many other reasons that we pay attention to that element of unintended effects. The third principle is the value, to value things that matter. There are many things that could be valued, but it is necessary to constrain ourselves to only those that are specifically relevant to the purpose of our organization and to what we are committing, because that's what we need to start measuring with that focus. The fourth principle is only include what is material, and this relates precisely to while you can identify different changes, we should constrain to these conclusions of what is our contribution to the relevant goals for the purpose of our report. The fifth principle, do not overclaim, which could be very tempting in some cases. So the recommendation, the principle is to be more on the cautious side and only claim the value generated that can be attributed by the activities we are responsible for. The sixth principle is to be transparent. It's important to demonstrate that the way in which the analysis is being produced has been assessed and considered the different elements that are available to us, and that we are reporting in a very honest manner with the stakeholders as well. And finally, the principle of verifying the result to ensure appropriate independent assurance of what we are seeing. An external opinion could be crucial in helping us to realize that some information could have a different interpretation or implication other than the one we are spotting. It is important to follow, as I was saying before, an appropriate methodology and being consistent with the approach as to how we are assessing, identifying and reporting the social impact. And in particular, when we are dealing with sophisticated investors, with sophisticated and more professionalized, institutionalized organizations that we are approaching for obtaining resources, well, we can be sure also that those organizations will run a social or sustainable impact test. And so that's something that has also evolved in terms of how to check, how to control that the impact that an organization is reporting as an achievement in the goals of social sustainable impact are actually consistent with the methodology and are consistent to the eyes of the revision by the investor or the financial intermediary, or a combination of them independently could be as well, and by other people who might have a good reason to be interested in verifying that is accurate and consistent, especially the different results of your activity in terms of social impact. Finally, I would like to mention or to introduce another actor. We talk about three main pillars: the entrepreneurs, investors, and financial intermediaries. But frequently it is overlooked the ethical consumer. Ethical consumer is an element of the greatest importance because the success of the social enterprise will depend much on how convincing and how effective they have been in attracting the sympathy and in attracting the interest of the consumer to buy the services and support the organization. So, to large extent, it's not sometimes a problem of convincing a sponsor, an investor. It's not only a problem of convincing the team to collaborate in a social enterprise, but the problem of how we are going to interact and follow up on what the consumer is telling us. Consumers in different countries have very different levels of organization, and for the same reason, very different access to tools and structures that allows them to distinguish or differentiate between companies that are offering services. However, in some places that has been evolving much. And again, I want to go back to the example of an organization in the UK. Ethical Consumer is been operating since 1985, and they have been very successful in their development of a methodology that helps consumers to distinguish between services, products, and whole organizations that meet or not, or meet in different degrees, certain criteria as to what is a responsible company, or what is an ethical company, or what is a company that is genuinely committed to the social development goals, or equivalent criteria that is or are relevant to the consumer. However, that methodology was not broadly applied in the context of the social finance industry until this month. Ethical Consumer has released a very useful series of assessments, and we have now a table about how in the criteria used by this organization rank the well-known financial mainstream organizations, and how the organizations that are associated to the social finance movement in terms of the ethos of the company, how they are doing. So I think it's a very useful element. Whether or not you agree with the outcome, I think as an example of methodology that helps us to distinguish what the consumer is actually seeing, or how this type of information is driving their willingness to support or not certain organizations, it's becoming very useful, and it's becoming something that is talking to other points of reference about the progress in the transition towards a more an economy that is more based or guided by the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is something that could be well implemented as well in different places in other countries, but it's a methodology that clearly will provide new elements for the purpose of social impact reporting. And something else important is that sometimes when we talk about ethical consumption, ethical consumer, in many cases it comes to our mind the idea of campaigners, civil society, or demonstrators against some companies. However, now there are some new developments that may be changing that idea that we have of the ethical consumer. In some countries, such as the UK, we have now the Social Value Act 2012. That law encourages local authorities to look as potential providers of services for procurement, commissioning, organizations that could be more competitive now if they are assessed in terms of what is the social impact, the sustainable impact that could be generated if the local authority hires or commissions a series of activities, projects with organizations that come with the offer of this added value, as opposed to an organization that may only be competitive in terms of the price or in terms of the speed of certain services. So I believe again that we don't necessarily need to think this as something that excludes each other, but it's bringing now a new element that puts or pushes local authorities to play a role that is much closer to the idea of the ethical consumer, especially now that the decisions or the opinions have the help of, they are aided by methodologies that, debatable or not, are telling us something that we can verify or we can pursue in terms of how consistent or how meaningful to us as consumers are. So this is something that might be of your interest to explore more carefully, because of the implication that could have in case of its implementation, a similar regulation in other countries, especially if we think of the size of the money that is depending on the procurement of public entities. Well, that can be an important case for a further step towards the transition to the sustainable development-based economy. In the case of the UK, it hasn't been fully adopted by all the local authorities. There is some level of discretion in the way it is implemented, but it's something that I suggest you to look carefully and to see how that could be useful for adapting a similar idea in different contexts. And finally, there is a series of other actors that could be playing a collateral and a secondary role as opposed to the pillars that I was referring initially and the ethical consumers, but that are important in the ecosystem of the social finance or sustainable finance sector. And here we are talking about different forms of service providers, fund managers, different types of entities like credit unions, academies or schools that are explicitly dedicated to training professionally social entrepreneurs, not only in how to set up their social enterprise, but how to deal in a professional manner with the challenges that we have been discussing about the process of being eligible for social finance, the process that is behind the long task or series of tasks that need to be in place before an organization can seriously think of applying with success for support from the main providers of social investment. So these other elements include also the tax incentives that can be available or not in different jurisdictions. Organizations that are certifying the level of expertise of people running assessments of social impact, or training for organizations that are interested in learning what is expected from them in the process of applying for social finance. So in one of the resources that I am including you as well for your further exploration, from the Good Finance project, you will find a website, a web page where you can look for independent financial advisors dedicated to the area of social finance. You can identify also investment funds in a way that is easier to find out not only about the sheer existence of these entities, but also you can learn much more about how they align or not to the series of principles for social and sustainable criteria related to the SDGs and other forms of criteria that could be relevant depending on how someone understands what is valuable for sustainability in a broader sense. So that resource is also very easy to check, and it could give you a very good idea of the size, which is still very small, the size of organizations that are working closely with this perspective of social sustainable finance. What you will see is that yes, this is growing, but even if it's growing, and compared to the situation 10, 20 years ago, it is a big improvement in terms of more actors and more resources pooled together. We are talking still to a small number of organizations, and so that represents an important challenges, a series of challenges, because sometimes in practice the capacity of the available social financial intermediaries could be very limited to respond effectively to the potential of social investment, in particular if social investment continues to involve more and more individuals as opposed to working only with large investment funds. So because one of the key elements in my view of what is required for a successful system of financing the Sustainable Development Goals is the involvement, the engagement of the different stakeholders, and that involvement is important to take place collectively, but also at the individual level. So one of the advantages of the way in which some examples of the social financial intermediaries is evolving is with the perspective of organizations that are relatively small, for a good reason, organizations that are not necessarily intending to become a multinational that will provide their service all over the world. So that perspective, that approach to provide services to very local communities is something that if continues, it will open, will increase the number of individuals that will require contact assistance from the financial intermediaries available, and that creates also the need of having more diversity in terms of who is providing financial intermediation, who is providing assessment, independent advice for what are the best options depending on the particular circumstances. And I think that's one way of win-win situation, because it's one entry to the system, and it's one way in which more people can corroborate whether or not this is making sense to their own expectations as to how to better use their own resources, their individual resources, I mean. So the final implication of this is that we need to work along systemic principles and strategies, and it's much more than just encouraging the setting up of more social enterprises. Is much more beyond having more people willing to invest their money. Is much more actually about what, in the particular context of different local communities, what is required for a financial system or a subsystem of the broader financial system operating in particular regions. What is required, and sometimes what is required probably will be less complicated than we think, but in any case, again, we need to think as to what are the effects and the implications of changing the way the financial system is operating in different local communities. One example of how there is a systemic approach here is with the big society capital system. I believe it is an interesting example to take into account. The link to the website of the Big Society Capital is also available here in this talk. So you will find not only clear explanations as to how this entity operates, but how it's working to maximize the resources that are available for what they can do in particular in the UK. And it's interesting to know that organizations such as the Charity Bank that I mentioned or the Social Stock Exchange in the UK, they are eligible to obtain funding through the system of the Big Society Capital. So Big Society Capital will not provide money to the individuals or directly to the social entrepreneurs. Big Society Capital manages and promotes the systemic elements that need to be in place for the more effective and the wider use of the mechanisms that gradually in different countries are evolving and can be quickly adapted to what is happening in different places. So in the Big Society Capital website, there is a very nice series of case studies that can be read for free, and I encourage you again to take a look at that information because it will give you a good point of reference to look at how those reports compare to others that you could find, for example, in another country, how you could see consistency in certain principles and some differences in what is valued or what is regarded important for the investors, social investors in other geographies. So by doing that type of explorations, it will be richer your perspective as to what type of ideas are working or could be transplanted, what others can work perfectly regardless of where they are being applied, and it on the whole will show you how, as part of the social value principles imply, as opposed to the normal, the mainstream return on investment. In the case of the social return on investment, in the terms of social value, it counts much more, not so much a figure that represents an amount of money, but it counts much more what is behind that figure, what is the story behind the impact that is reported, whether it's 4, 10, 11, 10,000 or 2, 3 or 4. The most important element that I encourage you also to explore is how, in a systemic way, an organization reached the conclusion that there is a change created that can be attributed to that organization. So that's something that requires much more than just comparing figures, but looking at those accounts, at those stories that are behind the conclusions, and whether or not those stories are convincing enough to some investors. The truth is that is an element that helps us to understand or make sense of the world around us. And that world around us is part of what we are trying to improve with the Sustainable Development Goals. So those methodologies that help us to come up with stories that are not simple anecdotes, but collection of details about what is being observed and how that is or not consistent with what can be observed through other means of that are not necessarily provided by the company reporting their achievement. That is what will help us to understand and to have a better conclusion as to whether or not the current elements that we have to measure social impact, sustainable impact, are good enough to encourage us to continue in the transit that United Nations has invited us to make this journey towards finding in a creative way the adjustments that will contribute to improving the human condition and the circumstances in which our world is today.